My name is Ray Bennett. I was born and raised in Sulphur, Oklahoma, which is about 90 miles south of Oklahoma City. Our first television set was a Philco, which I remember vividly. The only channel we got at the time was Channel 4. Unfortunately, there were two Channel 4s, one in Dallas and one in Oklahoma City, and sometimes they kind of bumped heads. But of course, we liked Channel 4 in Oklahoma City the best since it was the closest. My first experience with Channel 4 was about 1952 or 53. I was just a little boy, and my family took a trip to the Oklahoma City area and stopped in at the new studios at Britton Road. We went in one afternoon, and I remember going into the station and someone coming out to greet us. Actually, he was trimming some hedges. We went up to what I think was Observation C, and we watched Danny Williams on his first interview show. I think it was called the Danny Williams Show, where he interviewed some old-timers who came on the Oklahoma run. We watched that for about 30 minutes or so, and then left. That was my first experience with Channel 4. Sometime after that, I got together. I thought it would be really cute. I was probably 6 years old. So I drew out on a piece of paper a news anchor, a desk with WKY written on it. I drew out a camera, and I drew a camera operator. Then I cut them all out and somehow managed to get them to all stand up so it looked like a studio. So I tore it all down and put it in an envelope and sent it to Channel 4, thinking, of course, they would contact me in my brilliance. Of course, never heard anything about it, but this was probably 1953 or 54. Graduated from high school, and I went to college at East Central in Ada. While I was there, I worked at the very small, closed-circuit television system, which was actually one camera, maybe two, and two classrooms. It was very rudimentary. Also got a part-time job at KTEN in Ada, where I worked running camera and switching on Saturday nights. Saturday nights, I was the only one in the station. It was a very small station. After college, I thought, well, maybe TV would be a good occupation. So I called Channel 4. I talked to Jay Spivey. He interviewed me along with Nick Hibbard. And I remember very vividly, they said they would call me the next Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Okay, so the next Tuesday came around. I got the telephone. I went into the living room, closed all the doors, and sat there and waited and waited and waited, nervously waiting for my first job call. About 2 hours later, almost 5 o'clock, Nick called and said, "Oh yeah, can you come in again? We're not quite sure." So sure, okay. So I traveled to Oklahoma City again, and they hired me. I actually started on the stage, but I was hired for projection since I had television experience and a switching experience. I started in projection, and I was trained by R.C. Barrier. R.C. was a morning projectionist. There were three projectionists, the other two being Richard Leonard and Ray Murdoch. Ray Murdoch was the other morning guy. So I worked in mornings for a while and then moved to the nighttime shift. So the other nighttime projectionist was Richard Leonard, who was a real card, really funny guy. He used to get on the talkback system, which was a way for the projectionists to talk into other studios and say some really funny things. His favorite thing, I think, was putting his mouth right up to the microphone and going, making it sound like a dog. Richard Leonard used to tease everyone. He would, one of the audio operators, Ken Copeland, was studying for his first class license, and he was studying every day. Every night he would come in and would study his first class license in the electronics portion. The way the test ran was you had to take the test in elements. And Richard Leonard would get on the talkback system just out of the blue and call into where Ken Copeland was and say, "You have failed element 3." Or maybe the next night, "You have failed element 2." Richard Leonard was a funny guy. He always had something clever to say. We did something a little bit different with videotapes. We had a countdown put on by mostly Gene Schaus on a videotape. A commercial would have a countdown, 10-second countdown toward the end. We used the cue track or one of the extra tracks. I think it was later used for time code. And I can still hear Gene Shaw saying, "Stand by, 30 seconds." And then this 10-second countdown, 10, 9, to where the projectionist would run the next tape or the next film, or it's just a general warning for all the operation people that a tape was about to end. You could still hear Gene Shaw's voice. Back in those days, we had lots of film commercials. In fact, most of the commercials we ran were film. It caused a problem during newscasts because we had so many film commercials. We had film from the newsroom, and we only had a certain number of film projectors. So Charlene Carruthers and her ladies who did the films, who handled the log, would take the films and splice them together. Sometimes it took an hour reel of film to run all the commercials for a newscast and maybe an afternoon block. Of course, the projectionist, when this reel came down, the projectionist had to go through and double check to be sure everything was in the right order and that there was spliced in leader between where it needed to be. It took sometimes 15, 20, 30 minutes just to go through the film to be sure it was in the right order. Well, I thought it was pretty cute because I like to talk to the television. Sometimes I would ask a question and the question would be answered. This is in projection. So I thought it was cute for me to ask a question. The question would be answered on the air. Well, Wilson Hurst was a live announcer at that time. We didn't have a lot of live announcers, but he would step in the booth, and just before 5:30 he would give the time, 5:30, and then we'd go to network news. Well, it became a habit every day at 5:30. I would yell out, "Wilson, what time is it?" And on the air, Wilson would say 5:30. Of course, he had no clue that I was asking the question. One day, it was close to 5:30. We were going to the backup slide just before we hit the network, and I yelled, "Wilson, what time is it?" And Wilson, who was walking down the hall, stuck his head in and yelled, "I don't know," and then walked on. I guess he never figured out what I was doing. Howard Hollers was one of the engineers who almost always ran videotape. He was a punster, a very funny guy, very dry sense of humor. Sometimes it could get him into trouble. There was one occasion where we were running a station break, and the audio operator, who I think was Louis Parks at that time, it was close to the station break, and Louis didn't know where this particular commercial was, which was a Mathis Brothers commercial. And frantically, Louis yelled into Howard Hollers, "Howard, where's Mathis Brothers?" And Howard yells back, "3rd and Southwestern." After working in projection for a couple of years, I decided I wanted to go back to college and become an engineer, which is like a mechanical engineer. So I quit, went back to college at OU, studied engineering for 2 semesters, figured out that physics was kind of a problem for me. But during that time, occasionally one of the projectionists would want a day off because there were only 4. It was difficult to take a day off, and I had experience. So the projectionist and I kind of got together and said, "Okay, Ray, you come in and you work for me, and I'll pay you directly." Okay, that sounded like a good deal. I got a little extra money, and they got time off. Apparently, after a few months, Joe Jerkins got wind of this and says, "Oh, no, that's not a good deal." So he put out a memo saying, "Ray Bennett, or no one can work at the station who isn't employed here." Okay, well, I was okay with that. I understand. One night, I was studying in my college dorm in the room where I was, and a phone call came in. This is downstairs. "Ray, somebody wants to talk to you." So I run downstairs, answer the phone, and it's one of the ladies upstairs, maybe Marge, one of the ladies saying, "Ray, the projectionist is sick. There's no one to come in, and Joe Jerkins is trying to run projection. Can you come in?" I said, "Sure." So I drop everything and ride from Norman to Oklahoma City. Probably just after the 6 o'clock news, I go tearing into the control room, and into the studio, into studios and into projection, and there's Joe with sweat coming down his face. And if you knew Joe Jerkins, he didn't sweat easily. He was a pretty cool character. I've never seen Joe so shook up in my life, and so happy to see me. So I worked the rest of that night, and maybe the night after that, when the projectionist was well. A couple of days after that, another memo came out that said it's okay for Ray Bennett to come in and work projection. And finally, Ron Heiser left, and Bill came to me and said, "Yes, you're hired." And oh boy, I'm a director now. I was so excited, and one of the first people I told was Pam Henry. She came up from the newsroom. She was walking by and said, "Pam, I just been made director, so I'll be directing some of your shows." And at that point, I had a flashback. Something I hadn't remembered in years. That sometime after my visit to Channel 4, some of my friends and I would get together and we would play television. They were always the camera operator, and I was always the one telling them what to do. Meaning, I was the director. Didn't know what that was at the time, but it was a premonition of my future career as a director. And I had no idea, I hadn't thought about it in years. So I was a director. I directed some of the morning shows, and I directed also the weekend 6 and 10 o'clock shows. In 1974, December 28th, on a Saturday morning, my son was born. My first child. Of course, I was supposed to work that night, and I said, sure, why not? There's not a whole lot I can do with an 8-hour-old baby anyway, so I went to work. My wife and I had discussed a name for the baby. I was leaning one way, she was leaning another, and she said, "Okay, you decide." I said, "Okay, I'll let you know tonight." At the 10 o'clock news, what I did is I put my son's birth statistics on the fonts. This is after the weather. John Anders read the fonts, read my son's name, which was Ray Bennett II, and that's how I let my wife know what my son's name would be. Back in those days, there was no internet. Some of the sports, if Bob Berry needed to put a sports picture up, the only way he could do it was to go out and buy a bunch of bubblegum cards. He would open them up and find the pictures of the people he needed. He kept a list and a file of all these photographs of bubblegum cards, cut them out, put them on a card, and that's the way we would shoot that card. And if he needed, say, talk about Roger Maris, we had a bubblegum card picture of Roger Maris to put on the air. About this time, I'm directing the 12 o'clock noon show 3 days a week. Danny's Day followed the noon show at 12:30. The guests for Danny's Day usually arrived 11:30 or so they could come in and talk to Danny and see where they are in the show and see what was expected of them. Well, one day before the noon show, I'm standing outside the control room, and Roy Ramirez, who was the audio operator that day, walked into the area where I was, and he has a small monkey on his shoulder. And I'm saying, "Roy, where'd you get the monkey?" He said, "Oh, I just took it from the trainer." After Roy had taken the monkey from the trainer, he went through a locking door that locked behind him, and it locked the trainer out. So Roy is in the control area with a monkey on his back, standing talking to me, and I'm looking at this poor monkey, and he has no idea where he is. He's never been around anyone in this area before. He's never been here, and his eyes are getting to be about that big around. I'm thinking, you know what? I think it's time for me to get out of here. So I left Roy standing there with the monkey. Apparently, I found out later on that the monkey's trainer did get in and took the monkey. There was no damage done, but it was kind of a scary episode. And that's kind of Roy Ramirez. One day I'm standing in the hallway talking with Lester Tucker, who was an older gentleman. He would come in and work part-time, a few days a week maybe. He and I are just chatting, and coming down the hall from was one of the ladies who worked upstairs named Janie Arnold, and she was a beauty. Well, she walked by us, and Tuck, who was probably 75 or 80, followed her all the way down the hallway, and I said, Tuck, you're too old for that. He said, well, Ray, I'm like the old aviator. Haven't flown in years, but still look at every airplane that goes by. Always was interested in WKY radio, and sometimes after midnight I would go up to the control room where the radio disc jockey was on the air live, and so we'd sit and chat, and I would watch him do his show. One night I'm sitting behind him, and Gene Lyons, one of the engineers, was in working on the switcher, the audio switcher for WKY radio. Well, he's installing a button, a push button over at the side. This was after midnight. And of course, Gene was an engineer. He had no idea what was the music that they were playing. Well, Gene's working on the button. He goes around the switcher. He plays back there. He comes back and he's looking at this button. And about that time, the disc jockey started playing A Boy Named Sue by the Man in Black. Now, if you knew that song, there is a point in it where what Johnny Cash was saying was covered up by a tone. And I'm watching Gene Lyons work, and I say, this looks kind of interesting. So Gene's working around, the Boy Named Sue's playing, and Gene comes around and he looks at the button and he pushes the button. And exactly the moment he pushed the button, the tone came on the air from Boy Named Sue. And poor Gene's eyes got that big, jumped this high, and you can just see the terror in his eyes. What did I do? What could I have possibly done to put a tone on the air? I had nothing to do with this, and of course the tone only lasts about a second. And the disc jockey calmed down. No, it's okay, it's on the record like that. And you just see Gene's relief in his eyes. I was directing the weekend shows, and Mike Simmons, who was the weeknight director, left, so they offered me that position, which I accepted. The anchors were Bob Berry with sports, Jack Ogle news, and Jim Williams weather. A little bit later, Brad Edwards came in. Our news set at the time was a black set, the famous black set. It was a triad with the newsman in front and the weather and sports behind them. In the opening shot, we could have all three people on the air at the same time. Well, after a few years, the black set kind of showed its age, and we thought, well, it'd be a good time to change sets. So Joe Jerkins got the directors and some of the news people, and by committee, we decided we would design a set. I think George Thomas came up with the idea, well, maybe a round set, because we had a round set in Washington, I think he said. So we thought, a round set, that sounds pretty interesting. So we designed this set in the round. They started doing promotions, and they started running newspaper ads. About a week before we were supposed to go on the air, we did our first dry run. We taped it, and after the taping, we went into the Studio E at that time and watched the tape back. After we finished watching the rehearsal, there was dead silence. I don't know what everyone else is thinking, but I'm thinking, that's the ugliest thing I have ever seen in my life. It was horrible. But we were stuck, so we went on the air with a round set. It lasted about a year. After a year, I think Joe went to Doyle Glazier, who was one of the most talented people I've ever met. Said, okay, Doyle, design us a set. Doyle came up with this beautiful sweeping desk and a magnificent set. That's kind of what happens when you design by committee and when you have one of the best designers anywhere. Doyle Glazier was a gentleman and a true genius. It's amazing some of the limitations we put on ourselves. Over-the-shoulder boxes. We thought the over-the-shoulder box needed to be behind the anchor. Doyle Glazier came up with an idea where he put a chroma key box behind the anchor and gave the director a switch. I would push the switch, a light would go on behind the anchor, behind the cyclorama, and would cause a blue box to appear with a white border around it that we could chroma key a picture in. So the anchor was on camera and the box was behind him. Now, these days it doesn't matter, the box is always in front of the anchor, but that's kind of the things that we thought was in bad taste back then, but how things change. Sometimes the network was routed through Channel 4 studios. One occasion, It was routed through our studios, and we were doing a rehearsal for the Stars and Stripes show. Somehow, and we think maybe a patch cord got moved, the network was changed south from Oklahoma City from the network program to the rehearsal of the Stars and Stripes show down at the Myriad Center. That went on the air in the south part of the United States for about 10 minutes before they figured out what was going on and switched away from us. I'm directing the 6 and 10 o'clock news. Between the 6 and 10 o'clock news, there was enough time, sometimes the camera operators got to go home for dinner. Well, Bill Lambert, bless his heart, decided to go home for dinner one night. When he came back, it was pouring down, raining, and he was drenched. About 9 o'clock, I'm walking through the studio, and I notice all the lights are on. And I look up, and I see underwear, I see shirts. Bill, what happened? Well, I'm wet. I just thought I would try to dry these clothes. So I turned on all the lights in the studio and pointed them at his underwear to dry it out so he would be dry for the 10 o'clock news. Sometimes I would direct an OU football game or the Barry Switzer show. Before the Barry Switzer show, it was a Chuck Fairbanks show. This was when I was in projection, and I was there till midnight, until sign-off, and a lot of times on the Chuck Fairbanks show, they would still be taping his show, or maybe they haven't even started, because the film had to be edited, and after the film was edited, maybe at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, Chuck Fairbanks would sit down and he would start writing out what he's going to say. He couldn't write it out while the film was editing. He had to wait for the film to be edited for some odd reason. And the crew, everybody would just have to sit around for maybe an hour while Chuck wrote out what he wanted to say. Then they would start the tape, start taping, and maybe finish at 3 o'clock in the morning. When Barry Switzer came in, he was having none of that. So Barry would, they would edit the tape. He demanded that it be finished early. So they may do the Barry Switzer show and be finished by 9 o'clock, which was really amazing. Barry did not like sitting around, and I understand that totally. But my last day, I decided I did not want a party. I didn't want any recognition. I just wanted to leave and kind of mosey off into the sunset. The last day I came to work, came in at 3 o'clock, and there was a note on my desk, go see Bill Thrash. So I go into Bill's office, and he's not there, and I'm a little perturbed. He wanted to see me. He's not here. Where is he? All right, he's down in Studio E. Okay. So I walked down to Studio E, which was an audio booth, and I opened the door, and everyone was there. And they yelled, "Surprise!" It was a surprise going-away party for me. Everyone was there. Ernie Katoff had made a really nice little card for me, and everyone had signed it. I went around and shook everyone's hand. It was pretty sad for me to leave. The final thing about that party was I was leaving the party. Everyone was leaving. I was standing outside the Studio E, and Bill Thrash came up to me, held his hand out, shook my hand, and said, "Friend." That's the only thing he said. He really stayed with me. He was a fine man. Some of the other people I worked...
3,
2... Some of the other geniuses I worked with. That sounds awful.
You're not referring to me. You know, I haven't heard about it.
That sounds like really sarcastic. Some of the other geniuses I worked with.
Metaphor was never sarcastic.
No.
Steve Shouse, the king of sarcasm. Okay.
So we got 3 more shots.
44 minutes we're running. 8,
Yeah.
3, 2.
Another genius I worked with.
How many things of those in? I'm sorry. They're too good to write.
You better not leave that
I
in.
am.
You better not. I know where you live.
You're going to be long gone.
I know where you live.
3, 2.
I worked at a lot of other places, including 5 other television stations, computer store. Every place I worked has been a fine place to work, but no other place felt like home than Channel 4 in Oklahoma City.